Good morning. I wanted just to close off our week of study in terms of the storyline of Scripture. I think it's helpful for us to look at how the Scriptures are composed for our understanding and why we need to have hermeneutics as a practice and method for biblical interpretation. There is a storyline of Scripture, and one thing I want you to think about is Christ filling all of the pages of Scripture from beginning to end. So from the beginning time of Genesis all the way to the book of Revelation, you should be seeing the emphasis on Jesus Christ as the Word. Now, we're not going to uncover Christ under every block or stone or pebble, but what is strongly emphasized by biblical hermeneutic scholars is that Christ is present. Christ is the focal message of all of Scripture, and John 1 relays that information to us as John says that he is the Logos, he's the beginning and the end. And therefore, we need to treat Christ as we're interpreting the biblical storyline and come to an understanding that Jesus is here, present, and there is a redemptive focus, a redemptive line that ties us from the beginning of Scripture to the end, that Christ is redeeming mankind and causing us to come into conformity to his image or to the image of Jesus Christ. And that's the sum total hermeneutics as we look at it from beginning to end. That's what we want to see unfold. And so the storyline of Scripture, Christ is in all the pages of Scripture. There are also levels of meaning. What was the author's original intent? So I think a lot of people get hung up on this. They tried to find a new meaning of the text when the author had an original thought, has an original audience in mind, and therefore we're to treat that audience with clarity. We're to discern who they were, and then based on that interpretation, we move with the meaning of the text. And then there's a literal level, or there's a spiritual level. Some people overly spiritualize a text, and therefore it loses meaning. Others take the meaning of the text too literally, and therefore destroy its original intent of what the author intended to give us as the contemporary audience today. Another thing we could do is we can read too much into the biblical text. We don't take it at face value. We derive some special meaning again and try to spiritualize it in our own life when really it shouldn't do that. We often have special favorite Bible passages that you and I attribute in our life through experience, through maybe a setting that exposes us to that text, and it jumps out in us as an alive text. A lot of people commit Jeremiah 29:11 as a special text for memory in their own life. They have reasons for that. But then what was the original meaning of the author of Jeremiah when he wrote that? The plans I have for you, plans to prosper. What does that really mean? And so we want to be careful not to read too much into a text and then overly spiritualize it in our own life. And maybe we derive some hidden meaning, and therefore it loses a singular meaning, or depending on your denominational background, it might have multiple meanings behind it. But then as we look at the bridge from the time of the author to the time of our own current setting, we do have to principalize the bridge in our biblical interpretation. We need to understand the culture, the time of setting in which the historical passage is set. We need to understand the culture in which the people lived. We should understand and discern the language that the people spoke. And then again, the time, the situation, and maybe the covenants that were being established. And then we bridge the gap into our own various contemporary audience today. We move from the bridge, and then we ask the greater question of what really hermeneutics then is for the student who is using the methods that we employ. Well, number one, it's a science, and therefore there are steps to biblical interpretation. You should ask those observation questions that we learn early in Bible college, such as who, what, where, and why, how. Those are good investigative questions that you and I can use in our Bible study. The words denote meaning. Therefore, the stories are filled with themes, tension, and often there are resolutions behind the biblical text, especially when we look at narratives in the Old Testament. We want to find the opening introduction, the beginning to the climax, and then ultimately the resolution as the climax is solved. Don't read too much into a particular text. Again, many of us have favorite biblical passages that we claim There are principles, again, that we want to emphasize and not say this passage is for me. Remember, that particular passage was written to an audience in mind. God was using the human author to write down his particular message for that group of people. So don't read too much in a particular text. Seek for what they say is the plain reading of that particular verse. And then your role in the interpretation process. Again, culture, tradition, setting can play into my interpretation. My denominational affiliation can play into how I apply a text, how I see a text. And I like how Klein says on page 7, wonderful things in the Bible I see, most of them put there by you and me. I just think that's a fabulous statement that you and I can look at and laugh and say, maybe I do rob the text of its plain meaning or its literal sense, and maybe I bring too much of my own cultural blind spots into the passage. And lastly, the meaning of the message. Who are the recipients? The setting. Is it the Old Testament or New Testament? If it's the Old Testament, how does the New Testament apply it? And then we want to look at genre, what type of writing it is, what are some of the theological significance of the passage. I hope this helps as you correlate and bring some sense of meaning from lesson 1 or week 1 together. And I would just challenge you to continue reading your textbooks and come to a plain understanding of a biblical passage, and by not reading too much into a particular verse.